You were never supposed to hear this. The records were sealed for nearly 2 centuries, hidden under layers of legal dust and deliberate silence. Imagine the autumn of 1798, Kentucky still a violent edge between wilderness and empire, a place where the land itself swallowed people whole. Along a 20-mile stretch of the wilderness road, 17 travelers vanish. No bodies, no screams, only abandoned horses, saddlebags full of silver, and a trail of belongings leading toward the tree line like breadcrumbs into the mouth of something ancient. Men who'd survived war, Indians, and starvation simply disappeared as if pulled from reality. But here's the part no one wants you to know. The disappearances weren't random. They formed a pattern. An invisible net stretched across a single point of origin, a point built not by savages or highwaymen, but by a respected family who sang hymns and broke bread in church every Sunday. That family's farm was the last light travelers saw before they were erased. And for 8 years, while the frontier whispered its own brutal lullaby, a killing operation ran in plain sight, under the banner of Christian charity. This is not folklore. These were men and women with names, wealth, and families who would never see them again. This is how power hides its darkest hungers, by cloaking itself in piety, hospitality, and order. What you're about to hear isn't just a story of murder on the edge of America. It's a template, repeated through history, showing how institutions of trust can become cages of annihilation. And once you see it, you'll never unsee it. Step closer. Listen. The harder you look, the more you'll realize this was never about one family in Kentucky. This was about control, about testing whether an entire population could be managed by fear and illusion. The Hardin farm was only the beginning. The Hardin family were not the crude predators you've been told to imagine. They were architects of perception, building a fortress of trust brick by brick, until no one dared question their virtue. Ezekiel Hardin stood like a monument of the frontier dream. 6 feet of muscle and scripture, preaching sermons that could bring men to tears, warning of eternal fire with the cadence of a prophet. Temperance Hardin played her role just as perfectly: healer, midwife, the soft voice at the bedside of the dying. And their children, Caleb, Josiah, Mercy, were the living proof of their public righteousness, embodying the frontier virtues of labor, learning, and innocence. This was the mask. Behind it lay the farm itself, 400 acres of bottomland along Beaver Creek, a labyrinth of barns, cellars, and outbuildings constructed not just for farming but for containment. Visitors saw tobacco fields and corn. They didn't see the smokehouse walls 3 feet thick, the root cellar that plunged deeper than any root could grow, the new tunnels dug under the guise of storage. And they didn't question it, because the Hardins had already programmed their minds. Hospitality equals safety, piety equals honesty, generosity equals moral authority. It worked every time. By 1798, travelers actively sought the Hardin farm, believing it a refuge on a hostile road. That's the paradox you must understand. The stronger the appearance of virtue, the safer the trap. The disappearances around Millfield were not random storms of bad luck. They were a system of luring, isolating, erasing, a system as deliberate as any intelligence operation in modern times. And the Hardins tested the boundaries of law and custom with surgical precision. Constable Winters would later say, he felt as though he were investigating ghosts, evidence leading up to the Hardin property, then silence, like a door closing on reality itself. But even Winters could not name what he was up against, because he'd been raised inside the same mental cage. To question the righteous was to question God. This is the true power of manipulation, not in the chains or the blade, but in the unquestioned belief that some people are incapable of evil. The Hardins didn't just kill bodies, they killed doubt. And once doubt dies, anything can happen. October 13th, 1798, became the fracture line where the illusion began to split. Samuel Fletcher was not an easy mark. 12 years on the wilderness road had carved him into iron. Disciplined, punctual, mistrustful of strangers, he'd survived ambushes and winter storms that killed softer men. Yet on that day, his horse would be found grazing alone, bridle hung carefully on a tree like an offering, saddlebags intact with $50 in silver, and a trail of possessions dropped one by one into the woods, as if he'd been pulled off the road by unseen hands. Think about that. No robbery, no signs of panic, no evidence of a struggle beyond a few flecks of blood. This wasn't frontier chaos. This was precision. Winter's search party tracked Fletcher's movements with a kind of grim disbelief. Every sign led toward the Hardin farm, and at the property line reality stopped. No tracks, no scent, no trace. Even Henrik Johansson, a tracker whose reputation bordered on legend, admitted defeat. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed the merchant whole. When Winters confronted the Hardins, their testimony was so perfectly aligned it rang like a rehearsed sermon. Every family member remembered Fletcher's nervous glance, his words, his insistence on leaving before nightfall. Temperance offered details about his stomach pains and the bottle of herbal medicine she gave him. Caleb claimed he'd offered to guide Fletcher but was refused. Mercy echoed every sentence like a well-trained choir. Winters knew the pattern of true witnesses. Minor contradictions, overlaps, human error. This wasn't that. This was choreography. Yet without a body, without a crime scene, he could do nothing. And so Samuel Fletcher became another ghost in the ledger, another name added to the wilderness road's long roll of casualties. But patterns leave signatures, and as autumn deepened into winter, more travelers disappeared, each vanishing near the same stretch of road. Each last seen asking about the Hardin farm. Word spread in whispers among teamsters and scouts. Something was wrong at Beaver Creek. But the farm's reputation was too strong, its aura of piety too convincing, for anyone to accuse them openly. This is how control works: fear in the shadows, trust in the open. The predator smiles while the prey defends it. By the winter of 1798, the disappearances no longer looked like chance. Every 2 or 3 weeks another human life blinked out. Merchants' families, even armed men traveling in groups. Each time the same signature emerged: a clean break in the trail, a horse grazing untethered, valuables untouched, a direction of travel pointing toward Beaver Creek. Yet Millfield remained silent. Why? Because the Hardins had mastered not only the art of physical entrapment, but the deeper craft of psychological control. Ezekiel's sermons grew more apocalyptic, warning that temptations on the road were God's test of the faithful. Temperance expanded her reputation as healer, dispensing her bitter tonics to both townsfolk and travelers with the same soft voice. Caleb and Josiah became the indispensable laborers every household needed, quietly reinforcing a sense of obligation that made questioning them feel like betrayal. This is how a farm becomes a fortress without a single wall, by building its battlements inside the minds of those who should resist. Constable Winters felt it himself, that strange pull to doubt his own suspicion. Each time he approached the farm, he found himself second, guessing, rewriting his own impressions, as though walking into a theater where someone else was directing his thoughts. The more people vanished, the more the community doubled down on its story: Indian raids, highwaymen, bad weather. Anything but the obvious. That's the inversion you must understand. Fear protects the predator when it is blended with reverence. The Hardins provided charity to the poor, hosted prayer circles, donated seed grain, and attended every funeral. Their public virtue inoculated them against private suspicion, and so the disappearances multiplied while the town rationalized each one as misfortune. This wasn't just murder. This was a pilot program in manipulating perception, showing how a narrative, once seeded, can override even direct evidence. It's the same architecture that institutions still use. Create the illusion of benevolence, repeat it relentlessly, and punish or shame those who question it. By the time Winters began to assemble a secret list of names connected to the Harden farm, he was already moving inside their field of control. His every step watched, every word measured. And deeper still beneath the farmhouse floor, in chambers no outsider had yet seen, the true scale of the operation waited like a predator in the dark. Beneath the Harden farmhouse stretched a hidden world the townsfolk could not imagine. They called it a root cellar, but Winters suspected otherwise the first time he noticed the timbers. Far too thick, cut from old-growth oak, reinforced with stone quarried miles away. By early 1799, the entrance had been widened enough to admit a wagon, its mouth framed by fresh soil like a wound in the earth. At night, lanterns flickered under there long after the family had supposedly gone to sleep. Travelers who stayed the night never saw that door because mercy guided them to guest quarters on the opposite side of the property. The architecture was deliberate, a main house built for show, outbuildings arranged to obscure sight lines, paths that funneled strangers exactly where the family wanted them. What looked like a farm was a stage set. Below it, tunnels branched out like veins. Winters, still without a warrant, began sketching the layout from memory, sensing a grid beneath the soil that mirrored the patterns of disappearance on the road. This is how real power operates, not only by hiding but by convincing you there's nothing to find. Each layer of earth, each wall of timber, each whispered prayer was part of the concealment. The Hardens weren't just killing, they were experimenting with invisibility, erasing people in such a way that no one could prove they'd ever existed. Think about what that means in a fledgling republic, in a land without centralized records. To disappear someone was to annihilate their reality. This was a form of frontier alchemy, converting flesh and memory into silence and profit, because while everyone assumed the Hardens were living off crops and charity, their real wealth moved quietly. Horses, weapons, rare goods stripped from their victims, entering trade routes under false bills of sale. Winters began to see the outlines of a supply chain built on blood, disguised as pioneer thrift. Yet even as his suspicions grew, so did his isolation. Each time he confided in a townsman, he saw the shutters close over their eyes. The Hardens were too useful, too holy, too embedded. And as spring crept in, bringing new waves of travelers westward, the operation at Beaver Creek reached its peak, a farm of fear feeding on the very trust it cultivated. By the spring of 1799, the wilderness road itself seemed cursed. Travelers whispered of a dead zone near Beaver Creek where compasses faltered, horses balked, and men vanished mid-stride. But no one wanted to name the truth aloud, that the Hardens' farm had become a vortex of disappearance. Winters' notes from this period read like the diary of a man circling a predator he cannot see. Maps, sketches, and lists of missing persons pinned to his wall like a secret war room. He began to recognize the psychological perimeter the Hardens had built: charity as camouflage, prayer as a loyalty test, medicine as a delivery system. Temperance as tonics, so famous for healing, might have contained narcotics or paralytics common in 18th century apothecaries, substances capable of disarming a grown man in minutes. Caleb and Josiah's late night wagon trips to sell produce in Lexington were perfectly timed to the disappearance of travelers with valuable cargo. Even the family's religious rhetoric served as a form of hypnosis, embedding guilt into anyone who questioned them. This is where you begin to see the wider pattern. Power is never just physical. It is psychological, symbolic, ritualized. The Hardens were running not only a killing operation, but a laboratory of control, testing how far they could bend reality before it snapped. And as their system perfected itself, Millfield slid into complicity. Farmers who had benefited from the Hardens' seed grain defended them. Parishioners who had confessed sins to Ezekiel found themselves spiritually indebted. Doubt became dangerous. Speaking it aloud became an act of social suicide. Winters wrote that he sometimes woke at night, convinced he'd been followed, a shadow watching him from the edge of the trees. His hands shook when he signed official reports, knowing each false entry was another brick. In the Harden's fortress of invisibility, you can feel the shift here. This is no longer a family hiding murders. This is a micro-state practicing governance through terror and illusion. And that's why you're hearing this now, because once you recognize the template, you'll see it everywhere. In governments, in corporations, in movements that promise salvation, but harvest obedience. This is where the descent stops being about them and starts being about you. We are now at the edge of the forbidden. Up until this point, you've been a spectator, walking through the corridors of the Harden farm as if touring a ruin. But to really see what happened, you have to step inside the architecture of control itself. Imagine standing in their candlelit root cellar at midnight. Timbers sweating, earth walls pressing in, lantern shadows flickering across hooks and chains. The air smells of iron and damp soil. Above you, the hymn, singing continues, a ritual cover for what's happening beneath. This was not random cruelty. This was deliberate programming. The Hardens used the language of salvation to disarm, the promise of rest to lure, and the psychology of gratitude to silence victims until the very last moment. And here is where the pattern touches you, every time you accept the story of an authority, because it makes you feel safe. Every time you equate virtue with power, you're walking down the same steps as those travelers in 1798. This is why I'm telling you this. This is why this knowledge is dangerous. It shows you how your own mind can be turned into a cage. I want you to do something right now. Type in the comments the phrase, "No more false sanctuaries." No more false sanctuaries. Put it twice. Lock it in. That repetition anchors the signal and breaks the spell. The Hardens are long dead, but their template lives on in every system that thrives on secrecy, obedience, and ritual. This halfway point in our descent isn't about gore or ghosts. It's about awakening. Once you see how a seemingly righteous family could run a farm of fear under the eyes of an entire community, you understand how any institution can do the same. The men who vanished at Beaver Creek didn't just stumble into an ambush, they were drawn into a story, and that story was weaponized. This is the moment to decide whether you're still a passive traveler or someone who steps off the prescribed path. Because from here on, the revelations get darker, the walls go deeper, the truths get sharper, and if you keep listening, the next steps will change how you see every system of power you've ever trusted. Past the midpoint, the facade of the Harden farm fractures completely. Imagine the map Winters assembled, each red mark a vanished soul, converging like blood draining toward a single wound in the earth. His notes describe a creeping realization. The family wasn't simply killing for profit. They were running a ritual of erasure, refining techniques of disappearance that would echo through American history. Below the farmhouse, Winters believed, was a chamber carved with deliberate geometry. Corridors aligned to the creek's current, stonework arranged in a pattern closer to a crypt than a cellar. Even the placement of the smokehouse above seemed intentional, as if the building itself acted as a vent or cover for what lay beneath. He started drawing parallels to the rumors he'd heard as a soldier. European secret societies testing methods of control in the New World. Churches doubling as intelligence networks. Preachers acting as field operatives for powers that transcended governments. Whether or not those rumors were true, the effect was the same. The Harden farm operated like a prototype of organized manipulation, creating a closed loop of recruitment, sedation, disappearance, and laundering of goods. Winters wrote that the real horror wasn't the blood on the walls, but the way townsfolk had been trained to defend their captors. He began to see his neighbors as nodes in an invisible net, each one repeating the family's virtue as a mantra, each one unconsciously enforcing the silence. And then came the deepest cut, the possibility that even he had been altered, nudged. or drugged during his visits to the farm. His memories softened at the edges. He would stare at his own handwriting and wonder who had written it. This is how power really works. Not only hiding its crimes, but rewriting the witness, dissolving the skeptic, making its predator indistinguishable from providence. The Hardin farm stands as an early, brutal reminder. Any system can become a machine for erasing people, while convincing everyone else it's a place of refuge. When you hear this, you're not just learning history. You're looking into a mirror of the present. And once that reflection appears, you can't unsee the shape of the hand pressing on your shoulder. By early summer of 1799, Winter's secret notes had become an obsession. He had drawn and redrawn the farm's hidden grid, memorized the wagon schedules, and matched each disappearance to a date, an item of cargo, or a whispered prayer meeting. What emerged was not a household but a closed system. Input, process, output. Travelers went in, goods came out, and silence spread like a narcotic through the town. His own nights were haunted by images of stairwells descending into soil, of a massive chamber lit by lanterns no outsider had ever seen. He began to understand the Hardins as more than a family. They were a prototype of institutional power, demonstrating how easily morality could be weaponized. Ezekiel's booming sermons about sin and redemption doubled as crowd control. Temperance's reputation as a healer gave her unrestricted access to the bodies of strangers. Caleb and Josiah's late night trips became untraceable supply chains. Even Mercy, with her guest book of hundreds of travelers, had created an early form of data collection. Names, origins, destinations, goods carried, vulnerabilities cataloged under the guise of hospitality. Winters started seeing his world differently. Every barn became a potential bunker, every ledger a surveillance tool, every prayer circle a loyalty test. He wondered how many other farms existed across the frontier, each one harvesting not just lives but information, refining the methods of control that would later scale into entire institutions. This is the forbidden knowledge that burns once you see it. Power never appears as fangs and claws. It appears as help, as faith, as home. That's why it works. By midsummer, Winters knew he could not go to the county militia without evidence. Any warning would be treated as blasphemy, maybe even treason. And yet, with each passing week, more travelers were funneled into the farm's orbit, their names marked in Mercy's book like shadows waiting to vanish. The Hardins had built something far larger than a killing ground. They had built a template for invisibility, showing how an entire community could defend its own predators. And as Winters stared at his maps one last time before riding back to Beaver Creek, he realized he wasn't investigating a crime scene. He was entering a machine. The summer heat of 1799 pressed down like a fever when Winters rode back to Beaver Creek for what he knew might be his last inspection. His mind was a battlefield between doubt and revelation. Half convinced the Hardins were supernatural, half convinced they were simply ruthless. As dusk fell over the valley, he tethered his horse at the tree line and watched the farm from a ridge. What he saw shattered the mask of Christian charity forever. Lanterns moved in patterns beneath the smokehouse, emerging through a door disguised as a grain storage hatch. Wagons rolled up silently, their wheels wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. Figures carried heavy bundles into the cellar and returned empty-handed. It was a supply chain, not a homestead. Winters crouched, taking notes, trying to memorize every detail in case he never escaped. He could almost hear the muffled cries drifting up from the earth, then realized it might be his own heartbeat. Here the descent becomes absolute. He was no longer guessing at a pattern. He was seeing it with his own eyes. And still, even now, he felt the pull of the farm's aura, a strange sedative calm that told him to look away, to explain it all as something innocent. That is how deep the manipulation ran. He forced himself to focus on the mechanics. Where the wagons came from, how the entrances were hidden, which buildings were decoys, He noted that every visitor was routed through Mercy's guest quarters first. Data collection, sedation, then disappearance. This was no family business. This was an early machine of covert power, a front for organized harvesting of human lives. Winter's notes from that night read like a confession. They are not farmers, they are engineers of reality. He realized if he left now and reported to the county seat, the Hardens would be warned before any force arrived. But if he stayed, he risked becoming another silent name in Mercy's book. This is the moment you must understand. The trap was not just physical but mental. Even the man hunting them was inside their perimeter, breathing their narrative. And as the moon rose over Beaver Creek, casting the farm in silver light, Winters finally understood the deeper truth. The Harden operation was bigger, older, and far more intentional than anyone dared imagine. Winters did not sleep that night. From his position on the ridge, he watched the lanterns flicker out, the wagons vanish, the farm return to its theatrical stillness before dawn. Every instinct told him to run for the county seat, but something heavier kept him rooted. A sense that if he left now, the entire pattern would vanish back into myth. As the first light bled into the valley, he descended toward the farm, not as an officer but as a man willing to gamble his life for proof. He carried no warrant, no backup, only his pistol and the map he had drawn by moonlight. Moving through the dew-wet grass, he felt the same uncanny stillness travelers must have felt: the sudden hush of birds, the absence of dogs, the thick scent of smoke and iron. The root cellar door stood slightly ajar, framed by new timbers. He slipped inside. The air changed immediately, cool, damp, metallic. Steps led downward farther than he expected, reinforced with stone and oak. He realized this was not a cellar at all but a tunnel, angled toward the creek. On the walls were racks of tools, coils of rope, and shelves of glass bottles filled with dark fluid. The passage opened into a vaulted chamber, supported by pillars carved from the living earth. Here the performance of the Harden family ended, and their true work began. Winters saw holding pens large enough for horses, heavy iron rings sunk into the floor, and crates stamped with symbols he did not recognize. Everything was ordered, methodical, like a workshop of erasure. No wild chaos, no blood-spattered frenzy, only the cool precision of a system. In that moment he understood how they had hidden in plain sight. By erasing not only bodies, but the idea of bodies, converting people into goods, then dispersing the evidence along existing trade lines. He thought of Mercy's guest book, an early database. He thought of the sermons, indoctrination. He thought of the tonics, chemical control. Each piece clicked into place, forming a whole larger than murder. This was a power experiment, a test of how completely a community could be managed, harvested, and reprogrammed without ever realizing it. And Winters, deep underground, felt the first tremor of panic. He might never come back out. Winters steadied himself against the earthen pillar, heart hammering like a drum in his chest. The deeper chamber stretched before him, lit only by the faint glow of oil lamps, left burning in recesses of the wall. Here the Harden facade had completely fallen away. No hymnals, no prayer benches, only the infrastructure of capture and disappearance. Along one wall, a row of wooden cabinets held ledgers filled with careful handwriting: names, ages, cargo, dates of arrival and departure. This was Mercy's guest book multiplied into a full accounting system. On another wall hung sketches and measurements, diagrams of the tunnels with precise notes on airflow and drainage. Proof the network was engineered, not improvised. Winters thumbed through one of the ledgers, recognizing names from his missing persons list. Each entry reduced to an inventory line. This was not simple predation, this was bureaucracy applied to human life. He could feel the psychological weight pressing in. The Hardens had built a prototype of something modern, a system that turns people into data, that processes bodies like shipments, that hides atrocity behind paperwork. It was as though he'd stepped forward 2 centuries into a world he barely understood. For a moment, he imagined pulling all of it into daylight, marching the county militia through these tunnels, laying the ledgers on the courthouse steps. But then he heard it, soft footfalls on the stair, a door creaking above. Someone was coming down. Winters extinguished his lantern and crouched behind a stack of crates, pistol drawn, his mind racing. Had they known he was here all along? Had they let him find this place as part of their experiment? In the dimness, he caught a glimpse of a figure descending. Small, deliberate, holding a candle. It was Mercy, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. She moved with the calm of someone tending her household, not of someone guarding a secret. She set the candle on a crate, opened a ledger, and began writing, humming under her breath. Winters realized with a chill that she wasn't surprised to find him. Her gaze slid over the room, as if she were watching a scene unfold exactly as planned. In that instant he understood. Stepping into the cellar had not broken the spell. It had completed it. Mercy did not startle when Winters emerged from behind the crates. She simply closed the ledger and rested both hands atop it, as though welcoming a guest rather than confronting an intruder. Her calm was more unnerving than any weapon. "You've come a long way," she said softly, voice echoing against the earthen vault. Winters kept his pistol raised, but felt the same subtle pressure he'd sensed in every prior visit. The pull to lower his guard, to doubt his own resolve. Mercy spoke like a teacher correcting a student, not a criminal caught in the act. She told him the Hardens were preparing the new land, shaping people for the frontier, taking from the weak to strengthen the whole. It was rhetoric so smooth it felt rehearsed, centuries ahead of the corporate mission statements and government briefings Winters had never heard, but we would all recognize today. He demanded to know where the missing travelers were. She tilted her head and said, "Gone where they were meant to go." Around them, the chamber seemed to hum with hidden tunnels and unseen witnesses. Winters realized she was trying to stall him, to entangle him in the narrative, until his sense of urgency dissolved. He glanced at the ledgers, proof enough to hang the entire family, but also a labyrinth of coded language and symbols he couldn't yet decipher. His hands trembled. In that moment he understood that firing his pistol would solve nothing. Killing Mercy would erase the only guide through this maze. But if he let her speak, he risked being absorbed into her logic, another name written into the book. The chamber smelled of damp paper, iron, and something sweeter beneath. An opiate scent rising from the shelves of tonics. His thoughts blurred at the edges. He forced himself to focus on the exit routes, the placement of candles, the angle of the stairwell. Mercy, still serene, reached out and brushed a speck of dust from the ledger. Her eyes fixed on his like a predator's. Winters realized she was not afraid of him at all. She was measuring him, testing how far her influence extended. The standoff had begun, and with it the final unraveling of the farm's secret world. Winters felt the chamber closing in around him, the weight of the tunnels pressing like a living thing. Mercy's gaze never wavered. She spoke slowly, deliberately, as if reading from a script he couldn't see about sacrifice, destiny, and selective disappearance. As the natural law of a harsh land, her words were narcotic, sliding past his defenses, making him question his own memory of the missing travelers. He forced himself to breathe through his mouth, to fix his eyes on a crack in the earthen wall, rather than her expression. In his coat pocket lay a single folded page, the map of the tunnels. He reminded himself that paper was real, names were real, ledgers were real. He still had a way out, but only if he moved soon. Mercy stepped closer, candlelight glinting off glass jars filled with dark liquid. She offered one to him, saying it would steady his nerves. Winters recognized the bitter smell of Temperance's tonics and knocked it aside, the bottle shattering on the packed soil. In the echo of breaking glass, The spell seemed to crack. He leveled his pistol at Mercy and ordered her to step back from the ledger. For the first time, her face flickered with something like irritation. No hysteria, just the faint annoyance of a conductor whose orchestra had missed a cue. From above came the faint scrape of boots on the stairwells. Caleb and Josiah, drawn by the noise. Winters realized his window for escape was seconds long. He snatched the nearest ledger, stuffing it under his arm, and backed toward the tunnel mouth leading to the creek. Mercy's calm voice followed him into the dark. "You can take the book, Mr. Winters. It will tell you nothing you can survive." Her tone carried neither fear nor threat, but a certainty that the structure would outlast any single witness. He ran anyway, the tunnels twisting underfoot, oil lamps flickering like dying stars. Behind him the echo of boots grew louder, and above all the sound of Mercy's humming, soft, measured, as if this too were part of the design. Winters burst into the pre-dawn air, clutching the ledger like a lifeline, knowing the Hardens were already moving to erase every trace of his incursion. The dawn over Beaver Creek was pale and metallic, like the blade of an unsharpened knife. Winters stumbled into the thickets beyond the farm, lungs tearing for air, the stolen ledger pressed to his chest, as if it could ward off bullets or curses. Behind him, the Hardens' farm rose silent and immaculate, smoke curling from its chimneys, as though nothing had happened underground. He knew better now. Every step through the wet grass felt like an invitation to a rifle shot from unseen hills, yet nothing came. No shouting, no pursuit, only the weight of being watched. He stopped near the tree line and opened the ledger with trembling hands. Inside were not just names but details, physical descriptions, dates, possessions, even strange coded notations that read like a liturgy of barter and sacrifice. He saw Samuel Fletcher's name in crimson ink and dozens of others he could not identify. It was a ledger of life converted to property, souls as inventory. But there was more. A final page written in Ezekiel's heavy hand that spoke of purifying the line and feeding the roots. The words felt like a blade slipping between Winter's ribs. This wasn't merely greed or murder. It was a theology, a ritualized system of control wrapped in hospitality. He closed the book and whispered a phrase he had once heard from an old Shawnee scout. "The forest remembers." Then, for the first time since entering the tunnels, he felt a flicker of defiance. He turned toward the road, preparing to ride for the county seat, to speak the forbidden aloud no matter the cost. But as he stepped onto the rutted path, he realized the world itself seemed to bend around the Hardens' secret. A wagon appeared on the ridge, its driver cloaked and head bowed. In the trees, figures stood at measured intervals, silent and still. Winters understood. Their power wasn't only in the knife or the root cellar. It was in the network, the consensus, the collective silence of a frontier town built on fear. He gripped the ledger tighter. "If you've made it this far, write, 'The roots remember,' twice in the comments below. It will mark your passage into the next layer of understanding, your own unmasking." Winters walked forward anyway, the first light of the sun breaking over his shoulders like a distant warning bell. Knowing some knowledge could never be returned once taken, but taking it all the same.